one day 2 members of the firm picked Whittaker up. He owed them money and they were angry. Kevin Whittaker was in serious trouble.
In the summer of 1994, as Darren Nichols was struggling to stay on the straight and narrow, another petty criminal from Essex was also desperately trying to put the past behind him. Kevin Whittaker seemed to be on the right track. He'd managed to kick his long-term cocaine habit. He was holding down a steady, well-paid job that he really enjoyed. He had given up drug dealing, and his beloved long-term girlfriend Alison was expecting the couple's first child. It was the kind of life that few would have predicted for the former tearaway, whose first brush with the law had come a decade earlier, at the tender age of 18. He and 2 friends, Mark Phillips and Alan Venner, drunk on a mixture of cheap lager and Pernod, had broken into the Kingswood Junior School in Basildon and started playing around with some matches. The handful of small fires that set took hold rapidly, and within minutes 2 classrooms were completely ablaze. Nearly £100,000 worth of damage had been done. Whittaker and his friends were seen running away from the school and were arrested a few days later. When it came to court, Phillips and Venner were convicted of arson and sentenced to 18 months each. Whittaker was acquitted, but was sentenced to 9 months youth custody for his part in a series of burglaries that came to light as a result of the investigation. After his release, Whittaker went back to living with his parents, Albert and Joan, who encouraged him to find work and to try and sort his life out. He went through a succession of menial jobs, none of which lasted more than a few weeks, and ended up spending most of his time on the dole. Despite this, he never seemed particularly short of cash or company. His friends would come round all the time, and they would all have mobile phones and expensive cars, but none of them were working, says Albert. Kevin had also started smoking cannabis, almost all the time. I told him I didn't want it in the house, but he just carried on regardless. Sometimes he would disappear for a few days at a time, and then there were times we would get phone calls in the middle of the night. They seemed really desperate to get hold of Kevin, but they'd only ever leave their first names, no numbers. At the back of my mind, I suspected he was involved in drug dealing, but there didn't seem to be anything we could do. According to one of his school friends, Simon Smith, Whittaker had started dabbling in drug dealing soon after being released from prison. He started out selling tiny amounts of cannabis strictly to his friends, slowly built up the scale of his business until he was trading whole ounces at a time to everyone and making enough money out of it and the dole to be quite comfortable off. By the early 90s, Whittaker's drug dealing operation would have been turning a tiny profit, had it not been for the fact that most of his earnings were disappearing straight up his nose. The first time I saw Kevin snort cocaine was at a party in Southend in 1992, says Smith. A few days later, he confided in me that he was a cocaine addict, but he was confident that he would be able to control it. But from what I could see, it was just getting worse and worse. Whittaker had many sources for his drugs, but the one he favoured most was a certain Craig Rolfe, an arrogant, stocky young man who seemed determined to make a small name for himself in the Essex underworld.